Being a Jedi was never about the temple that trained you. It was about what you did once that temple was gone. Ahsoka walked away from the Order in 41 BBY. Kanan survived Order 66 with one eye and a lightsaber he barely remembered how to use. That's why today I'm ranking all 7 levels of Jedi Mastery and what actually separates a title from a calling. Starting with the kid who never got either. Just a broken teacher and a blaster he learned to trust more than the Force. Ezra Bridger. A 14-year-old street thief on Lothal becomes a Jedi with a lightsaber he built himself, a master whose own training was cut short, and an order that had already been dead for 14 years when his training started. Ezra Bridger grew up picking pockets and sleeping in a tower on Lothal, surviving on stolen ration packs and whatever he could sell before the Empire noticed him. The Ghost Crew found him mid-heist and kept him, and Kanan Jarrus started teaching him to use a power Ezra didn't know had a name. That training happened 14 years after Order 66, in the wreckage of a religion that used to run on temples, councils, and 1,000 years of doctrine. Ezra learned to swing a lightsaber because Kanan showed him the basics and told him to try again. He learned patience by getting yelled at mid-mission. His curriculum was whatever the rebellion needed that week. His classroom, the inside of a stolen Imperial freighter. A pre-war Padawan spent years on lightsaber forms before ever touching a blaster. Ezra carried both from the start, building a hybrid style that treated a sidearm and a sword as the same toolkit for staying alive. He started at what this hierarchy treats as the lowest rung, a beginner with none of the ceremony older Jedi took for granted. Fans still argue about the label, Padawan, Proto-Jedi, or something the Order never had a word for, and that argument exists because the traditional Padawan tag sits uneasily on a path this improvised. Improvisation drove his growth. A kid who wanted a family found one in a gutted rebellion, and loss became the defining cost of that apprenticeship, one lesson at a time in the people who taught him. A beginner can only rise as far as his teacher can carry him, and this teacher survived the night the Order died by running, then lost the one sense every duelist depends on, and somehow came out sharper. Kanan Jarrus. A man who cannot see becomes one of the rebellion's most resourceful fighters, and that's not an accident. It's the whole point. Caleb Doom was a child when the clones turned on his temple, and he survived by burying that name and running. Years of hiding built a fighter who could improvise, scrap, and stay alive largely on instinct. That's a survivor's skill set, sharp but shallow, built for one more sunrise rather than one more decade. Real growth demanded a teacher he couldn't run from. Kanan finds that growth by becoming the teacher himself. He takes in a street kid from Lothal named Ezra Bridger, and the training he gives comes with no counsel behind it and no certificate waiting at the end. His authority sits entirely in the boy standing across from him, learning to hold a blade because Kanan chose to teach him one. Then he loses his eyes. The injury should end him. Instead, it strips away much of what was reactive about his fighting and leaves the Force as his primary guide. His stances slow down. His timing sharpens. He starts reading a fight through the currents around him instead of the shapes in front of him, and that shift turns a capable brawler into something closer to a master. The wasteland training built a survivor. The dark left him a guide. Fans point to this arc when they argue Kanan is one of the strongest proofs that a Jedi can exist without a temple ever validating him. His bond with Hera and Ezra becomes the evidence, since a title from a dead council means nothing next to a family that trusts him with their lives. The pattern holds because everything about his authority runs through the people he protects. Being shaped by a broken survivor is one road into the Force. The next name on this list walked out of the legendary partnership of Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, trained under a legend, then abandoned the whole institution and somehow came out the other side holding a higher bar than the ones who kept their ranks, Ahsoka Tano. She quit a functioning institution at the height of its power, not long before that institution collapsed on everyone still inside it. That single choice makes her the hardest test case in this whole video. Ahsoka Tano trained under Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars, one of the most famous non-traditional apprenticeships the Jedi ever produced. A volatile master, a war with no clean edges, and a kid handed a lightsaber before she'd finished growing into her own hands. The Council still stamped her Padawan and sent her to the front lines like the paperwork settled the matter. Her fighting style became one of the most recognizable identities in Star Wars. Twin blades, reverse grip on the Shoto, a rhythm that looked more like she was arguing with her opponent than fighting them. She carried that style through the Siege of Mandalore, standing in the exact hinge point where the Republic curdled into the Empire. And she walked out the other side alive, while the institution behind her did not. Here's the detail that breaks the pattern the first 2 sections built. Section 1 and Section 2 showed Jedi surviving after the Order collapsed out from under them. Ahsoka left while the temple was still standing, the council still convening, the whole machine still running at full strength, falsely accused, formally exonerated, and offered her rank back on a platter. She looked at that platter and walked away from it. Somewhere in that decision is the same trade this whole story keeps demanding. A kid who wanted a place to belong ends up proving that belonging isn't the same thing as permission. Fans still argue over whether someone who hands back her own title gets to keep the word Jedi attached to her name, but stack the evidence and a clear reading emerges. The discipline stayed, the compassion stayed, the judgment got sharper, and her real break was with a council that had already started failing its own students. Quitting wasn't the exception to her mastery. Quitting was the demonstration of it. If a Padawan can outgrow the Order by leaving it, the obvious question is who ran that Order at its peak. The man whose rank came from 900 years of judgment while the whole institution collapsed on his watch, Yoda. 900 years of accumulated authority sat in a body barely 2 feet tall, and it still watched the Jedi Order die on its watch. That's the irony sitting at the top of the whole hierarchy. Yoda serves as Grand Master through the Republic's final decades, the most senior Jedi in living memory. He trains generations of students, serves on the Council as its most revered member, and represents the single highest rung the institution can hand out. If Ahsoka walking away exposed the gap between title and conduct, Yoda is the gap's ceiling. He holds the biggest title the Order has to give, and he still can't stop the collapse coming for all of it. His combat style earns its own reputation. Small body, absurd mobility, a fighting approach built entirely on speed and control rather than raw size or brute power, which already tells you rank here was about something other than physical dominance. Some fans argue whether he's the strongest Jedi who ever lived or simply the wisest one, and the question rarely settles. What settles underneath it is a widely shared view. Yoda is the benchmark most other Jedi get measured against, and then the Clone Wars happen, and the benchmark fails. He's there for the final battles. He feels Order 66 rip through the galaxy while the temple burns without him, an ocean away on Kashyyyk. He survives, but the Order he led for decades does not, and centuries of accumulated judgment weren't enough to stop the collapse in time. A Jedi who called Lothal home loses his sight in the fight. Others lose everything else. The most senior Jedi in living memory watched that price get paid and still couldn't keep the institution standing. So the ceiling cracks. The most senior Jedi in living memory could lose everything, which raises a harder question. If the top of the Order still fell, the job of rebuilding the tradition landed on a single farm boy with a missing council, a missing temple, and barely any idea what he was inheriting. Luke Skywalker, a farm boy with zero formal training, becomes one of the most powerful Jedi the galaxy has ever seen by throwing his weapon on the floor. That is the whole trick of it. Luke Skywalker spends his early life fixing moisture evaporators on Tatooine, gets a few crash course lessons from a hermit and a puppet in a swamp, and somehow ends up carrying the entire tradition on his back. He never sits in front of a council. He never gets a formal title. The Order that would have ranked him was already ash by the time he swung his first lightsaber. His actual test comes in a throne room on the second Death Star, and it is not a duel. Vader is on the ground. Palpatine is begging Luke to finish the job, to strike down his own father and complete the transformation into exactly the weapon the Sith spend centuries building. Luke has every reason and every provocation. He throws the lightsaber away instead. That single choice, made with no witnesses who could promote him for it, does more to define Jedi mastery than 1,000 years of dueling academies ever managed. It lines up with what the last section left smoking on a mountainside. Survival mattered more than rank, and Luke turns that survival into revival. He spends the rest of his life doing what no council assignment ever required, hunting down scraps of Jedi knowledge and rebuilding a religion from memory and guesswork. Fans will argue forever about which era of Luke counts most, the young hero or the older exile, but on both sides of that argument, most fans still treat him as the ceiling. Everyone else gets measured against him. A father wanted his children raised in the light. Luke is the proof that vision reached the next generation. A farm boy could restart the whole tradition, but somebody had to see the potential in the bloodline first, and the maverick who did it defied his own council to train a slave child, then died on Naboo before he could ever see whether he was right. Qui-Gon Jinn. A Jedi Master stood in front of the Jedi Council and told them a 9-year-old slave boy was the most important discovery of his life. The Council looked at the boy, then at Qui-Gon and said no. That refusal defines him more than any lightsaber form ever could. Qui-Gon Jinn built his reputation on trusting the living force over the paperwork the Order used to interpret it, and that habit put him on the wrong side of the room constantly. He carried the title of Master, the same hollow honorific system that would one day be rejected by a Padawan who walked out of the temple on her own terms. Qui-Gon stayed in the Order his whole life, testing prophecy and instinct against a council that wanted procedure and patience instead of a hunch. Years of that friction sit in the record, logged and known, earning him a reputation as a maverick many in the chamber viewed with suspicion even after they offered him a seat at their own table. Then he finds a boy on a desert junk world who builds droids for fun and tests higher in midi-chlorians than anyone alive, and Qui-Gon does not hesitate. He calls it the will of the Force. The Council calls it attachment clouding a master's judgment. The war that followed made the question academic before the archives ever settled it. The pattern is thin, but it is there. A Jedi who fought his own council on instinct twice, once on doctrine and once on a child, and got the second one dead right. Follow that thread and Qui-Gon looks less like a rebel and more like the clearest set of eyes the Order had, wasted on people who kept voting him down. Darth Maul ended that argument on Naboo with a blade through the chest, and Qui-Gon died without ever learning if the boy he found was salvation or catastrophe. A slave kid lost the first outsider who saw him as more than property and never got to say goodbye. The Maverick died on Naboo with his read on the Force unproven, and the burden fell to the Padawan kneeling beside him, the one Jedi who would train the fallen son, hide the saved one, and outlast the Temple and the Council, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Still a boy, alone in a temple full of strangers, and Qui-Gon Jinn was initially reluctant to take him as Padawan. The assignment was made anyway. That single decision built the most complete Jedi in the saga. He earns knighthood the hard way, in grief, cutting down Darth Maul moments after watching his master die on the Naboo reactor floor. The Council seats him among its most respected masters within a generation, and the era that follows puts him at the center of everything. He commands clone armies through 3 years of war. He sits on the Council that Yoda himself could not save from its own blindness. He faces Anakin Skywalker on the volcanic plains of Mustafar, and loses him anyway. His fighting style tells you who he is before he says a word. Soresu, the wall, absorb everything, waste nothing, outlast the storm instead of matching it, patience as a weapon, control as a philosophy. Where other Jedi chase the kill, Obi-Wan survives the exchange, and that discipline is the exact quality that keeps him alive when the Order does not. Order 66 erases the institution in a single evening. Obi-Wan watches younglings die on the Jedi Temple security feed and buries the lightsaber that should have made him a legend. He carries Luke Skywalker to a moisture farm on Tatooine and stays close for 19 years, a rankless exile with no Order left to check his credentials. That erased title is the answer the whole ladder was climbing toward. Ezra found a family and a broken teacher, Kanan paid with his eyes and then his life, Ahsoka walked away from the temple to save her own soul, Yoda broke in a swamp before he could heal, Luke rebuilt from nothing on a junkyard planet, and Qui-Gon whispered from beyond death to keep the whole chain moving. You could argue Obi-Wan is the only one who stood inside every stage at once, and he did it as nobody, watching a farm boy grow up, keeping one final promise alive in the desert with no witness but the sand. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.